This is the Roots and All podcast, and I'm your host, Sarah Wilson. Join me as I talk about all aspects of gardening with some of the top horticulturists from around the world. Hello and welcome to this week's episode, where my guest is Sarah Dodd, aka the tree-hugging lawyer. Sarah is founder of law firm Tree Law and specialises in civil and criminal claims arising from disputes around trees, in particular trees causing damage to properties. She's also the host of Tree Law TV channel on YouTube, and today we find out all about her background, her work, and the law as it relates to trees.
I'm a solicitor. I've been a solicitor for 22 years now, I think. I trained with the NHS, then I did 20 or so years in corporate business. And then back in early 2021, I decided to realise a long-held ambition to start my own business and launched Tree Law. That was quite a long time in the making. So we launched on the 1st of November 21. So I'm the director and owner of Tree Law, which is a law firm specialising in legal claims and disputes arising out of trees.
Right. And does that involve domestic as well as commercial clients?
Yes, it's both. Mostly domestic at the moment, but my clients tend to be individuals, domestic property owners, public sector tree owners, and insurance companies. So a little bit of a mix.
And is that all across the UK?
Yes, it is definitely all across the UK. So I'm based in South Wales. I'm not sure if you can hear a Welsh accent slightly, but actually hardly any of my clients are in Wales. I've got a couple, but mostly in sort of London and the South East, I think is where most of my clients are. But it's UK wide.
Are you doing quite unusual work then? It sounds as if you're, getting a lot of work. Are there many people doing what you do?
I don't think I have a direct competitor in that there's a law firm that specialises in all sorts of trees around claims. I think various law firms will specialise in different sorts of parts of the law around trees, if that makes sense. I don't think there is one who is competing by doing exactly what I'm doing.
And why trees for you?
That's a good question. Why trees? The claims that I've been dealing with when I was working in corporate law largely involved trees. They were very much dealt with in a traditional way. And when I say traditional way, I mean, we've always done it like this, so let's keep doing it like this, which involved if a tree was a risk to causing damage to a property, then step one would be remove the tree. And that was sort of done without any, what I felt was much consideration as to whether that was absolutely necessary or whether it was the right thing to do or whether perhaps it was the right thing to do. But, we're in a climate crisis, so let's think of some other alternatives. And I was thinking, how are these legal claims going to change given the climate crisis and the fact that, we need to keep as many trees as possible? Lots of tree owners, like public sector tree owners, are going to be targeted and actually, mandated to keep as many trees as possible and actually plant more, especially in urban areas. What's going to happen? So that's why trees. I think I've been dealing with lots of tree claims, realised that they needed to change. I really wanted to focus on trying to create a new way to do them, which actually looking back could have been quite naive, thinking, I'll just set something up and do it differently. Because obviously that's pretty tricky. But that's why I wanted to focus on trees.
Yeah, it does sound like you're fairly pioneering. And is that why you've got your nickname, which is the tree-hugging lawyer, I believe?
Yeah, I think when you start up a business, the number of people that say to you, what's your elevator pitch? I think people are almost like obsessed with an elevator pitch. And I tried to summarise what I was doing, managing tree-based claims, but in an environmentally friendly way, keeping an eye on carbon emissions. And it was just such a mouthful. And I said to somebody once, so it's like, I'm just like a tree-hugging lawyer. And I could see that the penny dropped immediately. And I thought, as much as I'd almost shied away from that initially as a description, it just is such a perfect way to sum up the ethos of the business in a little bang bite. And then I can go on and give more explanation if they want more.
Brilliant. I love it. I mean, it does exactly that. It sums it up perfectly. So thinking about kind of more domestic claims, I'm sure people listening will have lots of preconceived ideas, maybe misconceptions around trees and tree law. But I thought perhaps you could start by just talking about some of the really common disputes that you find between neighbours that involve trees.
Trees on boundaries are, I think, the most common. So if a tree's on one side of the boundary and perhaps its branches or roots are encroaching onto the neighbour's land, whether that's branches encroaching and causing shade, right to light and shade and views, things like that can cause disputes. And then also when you go underground and you're thinking of the roots, where roots are encroaching from one person's land to another, that can cause things, quite minor things such as like bumpy paving, if it's pushing, if it's causing direct damage and pushing up paving slabs. And then it can also be, I was going to say more serious, I don't mean to belittle bumpy paving, but if you've got roots encroaching underneath the foundations of a property in certain areas of the UK, that can cause subsidence damage. And subsidence damage, cracking to property because it's moving downwards in the summer, back upwards in the winter, can be catastrophic damage. That can be into the hundreds of thousands, if not requiring demolition and rebuild in the worst situation. So yeah, I would say trees on boundaries.
So in terms of if you had a tree on your property and its roots were encroaching into the neighbour's property, is it then your responsibility to make sure that that doesn't have any detrimental effect? Or is it their responsibility to then kind of root prune that tree regardless of the consequences?
I wouldn't want to give a one-size-fits-all answer here because it can be dependent on a lot of things. But I would say that as a tree owner, you have a duty of care, and we'll all have heard of duty of care. You've got a duty of care to make sure that your tree is maintained and managed appropriately such that it doesn't, or it minimises the risk of it causing damage to a neighbour's property. So yes, you as a tree owner have got a duty of care to manage it. But then also a neighbour, where roots and branches encroach onto a neighbour's land, the neighbour does have a common law right to what's called abate that nuisance and actually take steps to prune roots and branches back to the boundary line. But I've got to say that with a huge disclaimer that none of this should be done without consultation of either an arbor professional or a lawyer or both, especially when you're dealing with protected trees. There's so much in the mix that can make what sounds like quite a simple step actually pretty complex.
Yeah, I've got you. It sounds like sort of communication in all of these things is probably key and could head a lot of problems off at the pass. Thinking about duty of care, do you have a duty of care to your neighbour's tree roots? If, for example, you were going to dig a pond and that meant slicing through their tree roots, do you have to be careful what you do with that as well?
Yeah, you do. And that's why I was saying that, that's part of the back and forth with if a neighbour's roots encroach onto your property. Yes, if you were to look in a textbook, it might say, yes, you can prune the roots to the boundary line. But again, you have to be acting reasonably in taking any of those steps. So you can't be pruning roots or branches such that it then impacts the health of the tree. So it's a real balancing act. So yes, both neighbours have a duty of care. And that's the same just in life. Neighbours do owe one another a duty of care to make sure that what they do on their property doesn't cause interference or harm or damage to a neighbour.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense. A couple of things, again, that I think people have some opinions about, or maybe a grasp of an idea of, but thinking about insurance when you've got trees near your property. Again, I know you obviously can't give legal advice, but are there things that people need to look out for? Or do you find sometimes people are scared to do certain things like plant trees in places unnecessarily?
I don't come across people being concerned about planting trees, but you are right that when you're taking out household insurance, trees will, they'll be part and parcel of the questions that you get asked before you get insurance cover offered to you. There'll probably be some sort of question about the number of trees within a certain distance of the property, whether they're within the grounds of the property or outside the grounds of the property. And there will be questions about whether there have been any claims in the past, any damage in the past, perhaps caused by trees. So that is something that's on the insurer's radar. Now, I'm not saying whether those questions that are asked, that will feed into like the underwriting, so the risk assessment element of providing insurance cover. Now, I'm not saying whether I think those are necessarily fit for purpose in 2024, going into a warming climate. So, yeah, I suppose I'm going to be a bit ambiguous here. There's a lot of work that's being done with insurers on risk modelling in relation to tree-based claims going into a warming climate. So I'm not sure whether I've answered that very well, but I would say that taking out insurance cover, yes, you'll be asked about tree-based claims and trees that are close by. I do hear people saying, well, before I get insurance cover, I had to remove a certain tree. I'm not sure whether that's right. I'm not sure whether that happens or whether that should happen. But I would say that this is something, you've got tree claims, you've got flooding claims, even wildfire claims now. The sort of climate-based perils are something that are really hitting the insurers and getting on their radar. So there's a lot of data scientists out there trying to work with insurers and underwriters to provide effective modelling so they can actually effectively manage and assess their risk. It's all about risk for them.
Yeah, well, that's good to know, because I do think sometimes, as you say, maybe these laws and, kind of standards are put in place a long time ago. And I do think they need revision, and we need probably a bit more of a common sense approach as well, which is difficult when you're trying to be, very sort of objective, I know. But you spoke about overhanging trees as well. That's another thing that I think people used to speak about, like a right to light or a right to privacy. But I'm not sure those things, do they actually exist in law?
A right to light does exist. And yes, a right to privacy does. And actually, there's a relatively new bit of case law on right to privacy, which happened involving an overlooking, and that was between the Tate Modern Gallery and a block of flats that were built next door. So there's some quite modern law on right to privacy. Yes, they do exist, but it's a really complex area of law. Perhaps in a high hedges situation, an evergreen hedge, for example, it's more complex than just saying, well, that hedge now blocks out the light to my property. There's a lot of work that's got to be done in terms of how much light there was previously, how long that property enjoyed that level of light for, if it's shading into rooms, like what those rooms are used for, what's their ordinary purpose, what do they need light for. So it's really complex. So when I have clients go in and say, I don't like that tree, it's blocking out my light, can we do something about it? Yeah, not necessarily. There's a lot of complexity behind the scenes, which I think it's quite difficult to get clients to understand that at times.
Yeah, I'm sure. And thank God you're on the case, because it does sound like a total minefield. So again, I think you go back to that thing of communication, don't you, I guess, and trying to work to find a resolution rather than just doing something utterly drastic and then dealing with the consequences. Speaking of which, I've just seen on LinkedIn, I think it was, an article about, I think they were a tree firm got fined quite a big amount for taking out trees that were protected. Can you talk a little bit about TPOs? And again, maybe if there are any misconceptions around it, or people think that it's easy to get a TPO, or easy. I think there's also a belief actually that it's easy to just override them and deal with the consequences later. But I have a feeling maybe that's changing as well, is it?
Oh, yeah, I would say, so TPOs, again, a massive, you could write a whole textbook just on TPOs, I think. And interestingly, fun fact is TPOs are pretty different between England and Wales. So as a solicitor practicing in Wales, dealing with some claims in Wales, some claims in England, that adds another layer of complexity. And there's a real attitude shift. So the law around TPOs is within the Town and Country Planning Act. And I think given that we are in a climate crisis, I mean, that's not up for debate, is it? Climate crisis, we're in a climate crisis. And you've got public sector tree owners, the planning authorities that manage these TPOs, more and more wanting to take a proactive step in terms of enforcement. Obviously, not only to adhere to the law that they've created in terms of putting the protection on the trees, but also to send out a message to people to show we are enforcing the protection of these trees. So if you go ahead and think, oh, don't worry, we'll just take them down, we won't get fined out, or we'll just pay a fine, as a deterrent for them. So you will see more and more, and I've noticed, I think, definitely in the last 12 months, a real uptick in seeing these being reported. So I think local authorities taking enforcement action and publicising it, saying, like, not on our patch. If you are going to consider taking down a TPO, we will come after you. So I think that's really good news. In terms of TPOs and the law around TPOs, it's so complex, and there's some areas of ambiguity where you can debate and there is no final answer. Where you've got a tree preservation order protected tree which is causing damage to a neighbouring property, in the Town and Country Planning Act, there is a nuisance exemption which says that where the tree preservation order protected tree is actually the cause of a legal nuisance, that protection doesn't necessarily apply, and that you can go ahead and take action to reduce or remove the tree without permission. And that is such a strong step to take, given that if you take that step without that tree being proven to be a legal nuisance, that actually it is a criminal act, which you can be prosecuted over. It's very rarely an exemption that's utilised. So there is a lot of ambiguity in terms of TPOs. So I think it's a topic that's absolutely ripe for some proper attention. And I know that some particular cases now, which may have really flown under the radar previously because trees didn't have necessarily the attention, the sort of community attention that they do now, I think that's really going to change. And I think these issues regarding TPOs are going to come to the fore. I have no easy answers with those, but to say sort of watch this space, because I think they're going to start getting a lot more attention.
And is it true that just as a kind of concerned member of the public, you can apply to have a TPO put in place?
Yes, anything to do with the TPO, you don't have to actually be the owner of the tree. So if you want to apply to have a TPO removed, for example, because it's causing damage, or you want to apply to put a TPO on a tree, yes, as a member of the public, my understanding is that you can go ahead and do that. You can get that permission, but then whether the tree owner, particularly in terms of the situation I was thinking of, was if a tree with a tree preservation order on it is causing damage to property, anybody can apply to have that tree preservation order lifted or for permission to carry out works of the tree. But even if you get that permission, it's still over to the tree owner to decide whether they want to exercise that permission.
Again, it does sound like a very large subject to get your head around, and definitely something you'd probably want to seek proper advice on. And thinking of trees in the wider context and maybe outside of the domestic setting, is there anything that is particularly interesting for you in terms of the legislation around biodiversity net gain? I'm thinking more around things like, okay, yes, we can improve net gain by planting more trees, but in the meantime, if that means we're removing maybe a niche habitat or ancient woodland, is there anything around the protection for those kind of trees that you know of?
I know that the stuff like ancient and veteran trees, there is at the moment no additional protections in relation to them. I haven't been involved in a project that's had a biodiversity net gain issue on it because it's so new. But I think what's clear is the attitude has to be to retain what is possible on site rather than thinking, and I think this in general, rather than thinking about removing and replacing with replanting. Because you're right in that there are certain habitats that you just simply cannot replace that develop over time. But yeah, I'm not sure I'm going to be able to give you a really full answer on that, Sarah. Sorry.
As you say, it's tricky, and it is a bit of a minefield, I think, and it's probably something that will, carry on and develop as we go through the process and over time. Again, speaking about trees in the wider context, I'm assuming that, given your stance and your elevator pitch, do you think that there is enough done to protect trees through the law, or do you think we've got quite a long way to go?
Well, that's a good question. The common law that I deal with, nuisance and negligence and whatnot, that is made by judges' decisions. And, I say not many of these claims go before judges. You don't get very many judgments that sort of create and iterate on that law very often. And I'm confident that there's going to come a time when one of these cases gets before a judge and actually the judge or judges talk about the public policy issue of climate change requiring a slightly different outcome to one that may have been perhaps appropriate back in, 1995, for example. But then I worry that I'm thinking that because this is my day in, day out, and I worry that day may take a bit longer to come than I hope it does. It's very expensive to bring cases to trial, and I worry that it's going to take a while for there to be a claimant with the funding that wants to take a claim all the way to trial for a judgment where there's such a significant environmental element to it that it could change or iterate the law slightly to give increased protection to trees. That's one thing, but I think the law, in terms of where you go to look at the law that protects trees, is in so many different places. It's in those judgments that I was talking about. It's in those contracts of insurance and, household insurance, and that's law, that's contract law. It's in statutes, it's in the Town and Country Planning Act. It's in the Environment Act, for example. You were talking about biodiversity net gain, that's in the Environment Act. The Environment Act also brings in issues around trees with a duty to consult. So if a public sector tree owner wants to remove a street tree, they have to consult with their local residents. So it starts getting involved members of the public into those claims. So it is in lots of different areas, but I don't think it's currently fit for purpose. And I think there is a lot of change that is needed. And I don't know how long that's going to take for that change to come. I'm thinking positively and thinking next time when these big cases get to court, the environment's bound to sort of weave its way throughout the judgment. But I don't want to be disappointed and see that that doesn't happen. So I will keep my fingers crossed.
I am very much of the opinion that I don't like to sit back and wait because I'm massively impatient. So given that point of view, is there anything that individuals can do to kind of make change or to make their voices heard more?
The best thing individuals can do is to stay involved in what's happening in their local community. I mean, I suppose things like the Sheffield Street tree issue, I'm not meaning to belittle it by calling it an issue, leading into things like the Environment Act. The Environment Act and the bit about local authorities needing to consult with local residents on tree removal, that is largely as a result of the Sheffield Street tree protesters and what happened there to try and stop that happening again. So I would say, as members of the public, keep an eye on what is happening. If the duty to consult is only recently live, so you will start seeing local authorities wanting to consult with residents on street tree removal. And to do that, you'll see notices pinned on trees. So I think it's, keep an eye out for things like that. Get involved, make an objection if you think you want to. There'll be a process on the notice which will advise you how to make an objection. So yeah, but I feel like I could be saying the obvious here because I think a lot of people are already doing that, getting in contact with their local authorities. I don't want to be a nuisance myself, but, make your voice heard. So whether that's needing to raise a complaint to the local authority or the local government ombudsman, or raise a complaint in terms of insurance, how insurance might be doing with things. For example, there's always the insurance complaint system and then the financial ombudsman service as a complaint. Using those tools. The absolute nuclear tool that you can use in a lot of these situations is judicial review. Now, I've spoken to quite a few campaign groups about whether or not to use a judicial review, which is basically when you bring a legal claim to the court saying that you think that the decision made by that public body was wrong. That's got to be done quickly. That's got to be done within 6 months of a decision. So if that is ever to be considered, you need to move fast. So if you want to be involved and you've got loads and loads of money to spend on this sort of thing, then you need to be proactive and move quickly. Yeah, so I don't know whether that's a very coherent piece of advice, but I would say sort of keep your eyes open, pay attention, and act quickly. On advice, though. Act on advice.
Yes, yeah, absolutely. And speaking of which, if people did want to find you, and I'm sure if anyone's got any tree concerns in a legal manner, you would be the first person to ring. How can they find you?
So I suppose I'm a virtual law firm. I don't have an office necessarily. So you can go over to my website. So that's treelaw.co.uk, or you can drop me an email at hello@treelaw.co.uk.
Thank you very much to Sarah for sharing her knowledge and highlighting this hugely important topic. Thank you to you as well for listening. If you like this interview, I recommend checking out episode 12 with Peter Thurman, which was released on the 18th of September 2018 and is all about trees. I also recommend episode 90, Irreplaceable with Julian Hoffman, which was released on the 24th of March 2020 and is all about protecting ancient and precious wild spaces. You can download or listen to the podcast direct from the website rootsandall.co.uk. Please also check out my Patreon, where you can make a one-off donation or take out a monthly subscription to help support the podcast. Because if you enjoy the show, please help it continue. I also have a GoFundMe where you can make a one-off donation. Even a one-off donation of £1 helps, and I'll be really grateful for your support. So please go to Patreon or GoFundMe and search for Roots and All Podcast.